we had a precedent in the pandemic before where you had Indian IT companies, for example, or multinational companies increasingly offshore. So even though, efforts by the US may push up the relative cost of H-1B workers, and that may induce some firms to hire, US nationals, it will lead to a broader, push, I think, towards greater offshoring, which has benefited India in the last few years in the form of strong service exports. Be that as it may, the external sector still does provide some headwinds. I think the hope in India is that you've got a number of domestic supports that have built up that could partially offset these, export headwinds. We've had, record low inflation this year. The year's going to end, the fiscal year is going to end with just 2.5% inflation. We've had a monetary easing cycle earlier that's playing through the system. The GST tax cuts kick in from today. We had direct tax cuts earlier in the year, and you had a very strong monsoon. So the hope is that all of these factors will reinforce some kind of consumption revival in the coming months and quarters, and that should at least partially offset some of the headwinds from the tariffs from the US. The hope, of course, is that we're back on the negotiating table and some trade deal with the US will eventually be reached.
So, Sajjid, it seems again that this is a strong bet on the Indian consumer driving growth in India and offsetting the impact of the tariffs. I wonder what the net effect has been for or will be for the Indian economy, because on one hand you have these punitive tariffs that could hit the economy hard, but again the hope of that consumption to really offset that. Net, how has this altered your own outlook for Indian growth this year and the next?
Yeah. Well, it'll depend very much on how long the tariffs kick in. I think there has been some front loading of exports to the US. So if a trade deal is stuck in the next few weeks or the next couple of months, India could absorb that impact because there has been some front loading. These are, however, very labor intensive sectors, gems and jewelry, leather, textiles, footwear, shrimps. And so what you don't want are for these tariff headwinds to preserve for much longer, because then you worry about non-linearities kicking in, you worry about job losses and the knock-on effect on consumption. So the expectation and hope here is if in the next month or two we can conclude a trade deal with the US and at least bring Indian tariffs down to the levels that the rest of Asia experiences, so that there's no relative competitive disadvantage, then this would be a one-quarter story, and that the broader consumption pickup that I spoke about will dominate the effect. If the tariff headwinds continue for several quarters, then that has the prospect of not just impacting employment, consumption, but also animal spirits and investment more generally, which is why it's really important, I think, that we conclude this deal. Having said that, there's clearly an urgency to diversify trade. We've already had a trade deal with the UK. There are negotiations on with the EU. And the hope onshore is we'll conclude a deal with the EU, sometime before the end of this year. So India is trying to diversify its exports even as it negotiates with the US.
Yeah, and as you try to negotiate or diversify your export outlook, that is, toward these free trade agreements, the U.S. trade deal, of course, is also still important. With Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal in Washington, D.C. right now, are you hopeful that a deal can be clinched? Because there are some clear red lines and clear differences that seem to be difficult, actually, to achieve consensus on or achieve agreement on, sir.
I am hopeful that a trade deal will eventually be struck. I think I'm very much the old school camp that trade is all about, a positive sum game. This is not a zero-sum game. There are wins to be had on both sides. India is a large market, a market that's growing at 10, 11% every year in nominal terms. And so it's in the interest of the US for India to reduce some of its trade barriers, to enter this market, which, by the way, will also help Indian competitiveness down the line. At the same time, if India gets preferential trade access to labor-intensive sectors in the US that I just spoke about, textiles, gems and jewelry, leather, footwear, that is in India's interest as well. So I think there is a deal to be struck here, and I'm hopeful that this round of negotiations hopefully will be more fruitful.
Yeah, but with the recent news over the weekend with regards to those H-1B visas, does that complicate possible trade talks, and does that even add more problems for Commerce Minister Goyal to handle and to negotiate as he meets his counterparts in Washington, D.C.?
Well, it remains to be seen how important the H-1B visa is in the trade negotiations. But I think if you step back, the initial impact seems negative. Of course, the clarifications by the White House on the weekend clearly helped. This will only act prospectively, not retrospectively. This is a one-time fee, not an annual fee. So that, at the margin, makes it a little bit more palatable. But I think the broader issue here is, if you look at what research has found, is that whenever there are restrictions on H-1B visas, it just induces firms, multinational companies to offshore more vigorously. And that's exactly what we've seen in the pandemic. India has been a huge beneficiary of very strong service exports. JPMorgan is a classic case in point, where you've got these large global capability centers, back offices doing increasingly high-end work: research, legal, accounting, technology, engineering, cybersecurity, risk management, card structuring. So even though the H-1B visa may cause a hit in the near term, to the extent that it causes more multinational firms to offshore more broadly, India, as one of the recipients of that offshoring, will stand to benefit in the medium term.
In the short term, there might be a benefit there, Sajjid, but on the long term, I'm sure you'll also take a note of the fact that there is a bill that's being passed through U.S. Congress with regards to a possible offshore tax, or a tax on business services offshored by American firms, that could hit the likes of JPMorgan, given you have huge outsourced services as well in India. Is there a concern that this very important sector in India could get hit by a double whammy of, on one hand, the H-1B visas impacting them, and on the other hand, in the long term, perhaps being impacted by these possible taxes on BPO services?
No, that's clearly a concern. And if you can even step back more broadly, that we've seen the world's largest economy, the US, first impose tariffs on goods, then we've seen curbs on lower skilled immigration. Now on the weekend, we're seeing taxes on higher skilled immigration. The concern very much is, what's next? Are services exports and offshoring going to be next? And I think that's a broader issue for all emerging markets, because if you look at the last 20 years, what you find is the lifeline and lifeblood of emerging markets like India, their growth has been very strong export growth. And so if you're in a world where you see much more protectionism emanating from the US, both in terms of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and you're in a world in which that becomes a demonstration effect for other economies to follow suit, it's clearly a world in which emerging markets are going to struggle as far as exports are concerned. I would go further and say there's another challenge that many emerging markets face, and that is the excess capacity from China. Because on the one hand, you're facing a more protectionist world, which is going to create headwinds for export growth. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of excess capacity from China. And to the extent that China faces a 42% tariff from the US, the concern is that excess capacity will get redirected to other emerging markets, including in Asia. We've already seen this in the last 6 months. Asia, Latin America, North Africa, the Middle East. So now emerging markets have to both worry about how they grow their exports, but also play defense at home to prevent cheap Chinese imports from impeding their manufacturing bases. So yes, I mean, if you step back and look at the broader issue, the last 6 months, does create concerns for how emerging markets will grow in the coming years, and the need to diversify your growth drivers. You have to find new ways of growing in a global environment that's becoming increasingly protectionist.